Hello, everyone, and welcome to Editor's Pick of War Elephant Podcast, episode 22. I'm your host, Ian, and we have Christine back.
Hi, great to be back.
We are talking, as the title of our podcast says, about Dr. Seuss. And I've been reading and listening to a ton of stuff about Dr. Seuss since the whole Children's Read Day, which sort of kicked the whole thing off. And it's very complicated. It's not quite as simple as some of the people I've been hearing on both sides. Some people are like, well, these are clearly insensitive images, so it's fine. And some people are saying, well, this is cancel culture. There's absolutely nothing wrong, and which just up in arms. And I think that both of those knee-jerk responses, and some of them are even more considered who end up in those positions, I think those responses are inadequate. But before we get too far, let's talk a bit about where we are ourselves with Dr. Seuss, like our personal history and our relationship to him as an adult and so forth.
Do you want me to start?
I do.
Well, as I was saying right before we started, I actually went out when my nephew was born and I bought the entire Dr. Seuss collection because it's children books and children like imaginative, colorful books, and he writes in a way that engages children. Um, I was going to show these books today, but I apparently passed them on to another family member who recently had kids. So I don't have them with me right now.
Well, I personally don't think you did anything wrong by putting them in the hands of those who benefit the most from them.
That's what I was thinking. Um, I was never the biggest fan of Dr. Seuss growing up, to be honest. Um, so everyone else really loved him, but I kind of thought like the Cat in the Hat was really naughty, and, and,
Well, yes.
and he caused all kinds of trouble. And I'm like, why is he making these kids get into trouble and like destroy things? This was a problem I had as a child with it. Um, and I guess the art styles were never really my favorite, but I am not a big fan of caricature, and I never really have been. So, but I appreciated the imaginative power it had on other people, and certainly the sense of fun present in the books. Uh, from beginning to end, there's just a sense of whimsy to everything. But you would never find me having like a Cat in the Hat anything in my life.
I'm
But
still a
like I
bit
said,
annoyed that they picked Cat in the Hat as like the face of Dr. Seuss when I much prefer things like Green Eggs and Ham or Fox and Socks or something.
which I can actually recite many of the books. I've read them to
Well, I
small
mean,
children
if you
enough
have small
times.
children in your life, you've read them multiple times because those kids just love to read along. Because I think Dr. Seuss, I'm similarly ambivalent about Dr. Seuss myself. But he was a great genius when it came to the use of language and the use of caricature. He's just intensely talented in provoking the absurd and combining that with actually some serious thought. Like the thing about Dr. Seuss is that he actually always had some kind of didactic message, whether that message was kind of an anarchic, it's okay and fun to break the rules in The Cat in the Hat, or the extremely preachy message of environmentalism in the Lorax, or what I would say is actually a deeply moving message about humanity in Horton Hears a
Horton
Who.
Hears the Who.
Yes,
Yes,
that's very moving, especially because that represents something that we'll talk about later. Um,
and that of his works is actually my favorite.
My favorite is probably still The King's Stilts, which is very atypical
Okay.
because it's actually mostly prose.
Huh.
And has an illustration every page, but it's not a children's picture book. It's sort of like a middle grade book with lots of
Sure.
illustrations. And it's a fable very similar to the boy who stuck his finger in the dike in Holland.
Right.
Um, and it's very complicated and challenging. And I remember just on the cusp of transitioning from uh, picture books to middle grade fiction that was challenging enough, and it also had this really fun message of work hard and play hard. Like, do your work, be conscientious, do your duty, but then enjoy life. And I thought that was just very joyful and also a responsible message. So I do have really good memories of both being read Dr. Seuss and, of course, reading them to my siblings and my nieces and nephew now, who are 2 and 4. So
It sounds
it's
like you're
just
going to
the
have a
right
few more
age.
years of that.
Oh, yes. And I look forward to it. And we have, thankfully, some of the books that are no longer in publication. Because I don't know if we could get them at $3,000 a pop at this point.
Is that what they're up to? They were only about $700 yesterday. Wow.
Only 700. I don't have that kind of money either.
Well, it's a good thing you do, because I'm sure you'll want to read them to your own kids someday.
Yeah, definitely. So I thought we'd get started by talking about the statement that the Dr. Seuss Enterprises released. And we've linked almost all of the documents that we're going to talk to in the show notes, so go ahead and look at them. But the statement basically said that the rationale behind their decision to stop publication of 6 of the books, and this is a small percentage of the books. He wrote so many books, so it's not quite the same as Dr. Seuss's canceled, although
Yet.
I think that yet is the operative term. But they say that they want children to feel welcome and happy in reading, and I think that is a good goal. Because of course, it doesn't matter what color you are, what nation you're from. I think reading is an enormous gift, privilege. It's one of the things that really signals your ability to better yourself economically and intellectually, and it just forms connections and broadens your mind past your own perspective. My quote on my blog since 2004 has been, "We read to know we're not alone." And that to me means we read to put ourselves in the perspective of other people who are not like us. And so I agree fundamentally with the idea that a book with illustrations that might make someone feel like they're like the author doesn't view them with compassion, like the author kind of has ignorant or bigoted or prejudiced assumptions about them. I agree, that can be really difficult, especially when you're a child. But I think that the basis for which these authors, I'm not the author, the trustees, because I think that this move shows that they aren't really worthy of trust. The trustees of Dr. Seuss's estate are basing this not on a real concern, but are actually either in agreement with or being pressured by the scholarship on Dr. Seuss. And I've linked one of the most prominent studies that has been cited many times in the last week about Dr. Seuss from an academic perspective. And this is called "The Cat is Out of the Bag: Orientalism, Anti-Blackness, and White Supremacy in Dr. Seuss's Children's Books," written by Katie Ishizuka and Ramon Stephens, both of them academics. And their argument is actually not that only these 6 books are racist or participate in negative stereotypes against readers who are not white. They actually argue that because the vast majority of Dr. Seuss's characters are white or seem to be white, although the argument that they're white when most of them are some kind of animal gets a little contentious, that they participate in white supremacy.
I think they're talking about humanoid characters, not all the animal ones, maybe.
The article is almost on the level, and I owe a lot of my thoughts to the podcast that I listened to this afternoon by Brett Weinstein and Heather Hying, who did a really excellent I would call it a celebration So our perspective is not quite as positive. Brett and Heather have a really thoughtful and enthusiastic take on Dr. Seuss that I think is well worth listening to, even though I don't completely agree. But since Brett and Heather are liberals and we are conservatives, I think that is to be expected. Um,
Although our ambivalence versus their excitement is actually interesting in the terms of what you would predict versus conservative versus liberal in this case.
well, but they're very atypical liberals.
Yes, they are,
Um,
especially when it comes to anything woke.
yes. Well, because they had what is happening to Dr. Seuss after he was dead happened to them in real time. The
Right.
kinds of people who wrote these papers are the kinds of people who mobbed Brett and Heather at Evergreen State and who just published horrific slander, well, libels. Sorry, they were published horrific libels about them, and
But there was also
stalked the
verbal
grounds
slander.
of the campus.
Right.
Like the people, the same mindset that is attempting to tarnish Dr. Seuss's reputation and use as a didactic tool, a teaching tool for small children, is the same impulse that drove the just vicious attacks on Weinstein and Hayek. So I think that they're in a different position than a lot of liberal people.
I
Because
think you might
I
be
do
right.
watch several thoughtful people who are liberals who do agree that some of these images are troubling. Now, I think that some of these images are more troubling if you associate them with Dr. Seuss's wartime propaganda for World War II, in which he depicted Japanese people as traitorous and mindless, and just there's a real element of ignorance. And as someone who is a quarter Japanese, I definitely felt uncomfortable looking at those pictures. But I look at the pictures of the Asian people depicted in his children's book, and it seems to me that if you look at them carefully and with artistic sensitivity, the animating just negativity and ignorance that was in the political cartoons is not in these characters. In to think I saw it on Mulberry Street where there's a Chinese man with eating with sticks, of course, referring to
Yep.
chopsticks.
Right.
He looks happy. He doesn't look
No.
stupid.
And
He
and
doesn't
and
look ugly.
my friends were all saying how bad it was to say that they ate with Chinese people ate with sticks, and I'm going, I really don't know what you call these,
Like
because
that.
I was
It's
told
not.
they were chopsticks. Maybe I don't understand things. Maybe I have enormous things to learn, but I understood that this was a common utensil for eating in much of Asia, and
Well,
it's a very useful set of utensils. This is mine, by the way.
well, and the idea that it is racist to refer to him as sticks, I think, is a stupid analysis on two levels. The first, of course, is that um, this is poetry. You have to try and fit things in the meter, and the sticks does not feel like some kind of commentary on the barbarism of Chinese people. It's just that's what fits in the rhyme, and it's accurate. The
Right.
other thing is the
They're,
drawing does not show like two sticks, like some kind of caveman. It shows just chopsticks. It's very appropriately drawn, and I think that that's the problem. Now, there are some of the images, like the picture of the two African tribes people in if I ran the zoo, which I could see being a bit more uncomfortable. But again, I looked at them carefully, and they're not behaving in the kind of stereotypical negative ways like cannibalism or the kinds of things that make you really prejudiced against tribal peoples. This was more along the lines of uh, the dancing funeral coffin bearers. It's just
sure.
this is their culture.
Well, and to me, I just like, well, I don't see this any different than a lot of the photographs actually in National Geographic.
Yeah.
Or in the 1960s, there was a huge interest that began in forms of ethnic dance from around the world. And if you watch things that are choreographed and performed by Black people in that time period, you'll see a lot of costuming that hails back to that with dance moves that are actually quite caricatured. from traditional African dance. They're very exaggerated, but they're choreographed and performed by Black people, and I'm going, if this drawing is that offensive, what are we going to do about like the entire Black Renaissance art from the 1970s and 1960s?
Yeah. Well, and jazz from the 1920s and ragtime from before that.
But of course,
There's,
they'll say, well, those were Black people participating in Black art, and therefore it's okay. Dr. Seuss was a white man, and he was portraying people who were not white, so it is not okay. And that is the argument.
the argument is, I think, fundamentally an argument for segregation, and I think that is so destructive. I mean, one of the articles that I have linked is from The Atlantic, from a man named Mark Harriet. Michael Harriet. And
Yeah.
he is a Black man who was raised by a mother who refused, it seems to me, to refuse to allow her children to understand they grew up in a majority white country. His mother read him the Hardy Boys. Not only, it's strange, she read books and made her children's names the main characters' names. And she read them as if the characters were Black. And in one sense, I don't have a problem with this. I don't think there's any problem with imagining yourself into books, especially if the descriptions aren't given. But there was a real sense of Black people should read things by Black writers and artists, and white people should read things and write about white people and white artists. And if we do that, we're never going to grow in empathy. If you only write about your own experience, if you only write about things that and people who agree. I mean, it's like that famous Disney song from the 90s. You think the only people who are people who look and think like you. I don't even like that movie, but that's true. If you think that way, you are a deeply narrow-minded person. And that's the way it seems that this
was from
movement is
Pocahontas,
going.
wasn't it?
It was from Pocahontas. I don't like that movie.
that movie drove me up the wall. And it's
the
so
historical
funny
inaccuracy is so bad.
Yes, it drove me up the wall, and now it's actually getting dinged for being racially insensitive, and it was like the most woke thing ever when it came out.
Well, and that just goes to show you'll never be woke enough. If you chase the woke dream of trying to be politically correct, you'll be dated. Whereas if you try to be honest, if you try to show things with the good and the bad, which I think is one of the things that Dr. Seuss could do at his best, is he showed the good and the bad in situations that children could face in ways that would push them towards what he thought was good. And sometimes, as in, I would say the case of Green Eggs and Ham, it's good because, children are picky eaters. So Green Eggs and Ham would push them to try things they don't like and give them that feeling of...
That was fantastic because it's like, well, you can be so determined and know yourself so well, and then find out that maybe you weren't giving things a fair shake, and that it's okay. It's okay to change your mind too.
I want to segue with that. There was something else I was going to say, but I've already kind of said it. Change your mind. The biggest thing that really bothers me about the statement from the Dr. Seuss Enterprises is that they're named after this guy, and they don't acknowledge the fact that he changed. He started out using these very ignorant caricatures of Asian people in his wartime propaganda. And then in the 1950s, he had visited Japan and he dedicated Horton Hears a Who to a Japanese friend of his. And the message of Horton Hears a Who is a person's a person no matter how small.
I'm sure they can read racism into that too.
They can, but they shouldn't, because that's a message of humanity. That's a message of love. It's a message of bringing people together despite inborn differences of one person being really small and one person being an elephant.
Right.
I think it's horrific that a company named after someone who's theoretically supposed to be the trustees, they're in a position of trust, with his name, with his
with his
work.
legacy.
And they don't acknowledge the fact that he changed. Now, if they'd said in their statement, we think that Dr. Seuss grew as a person, and in the spirit of his more mature philosophy and embrace of all cultures and love and tolerance, we think that his early works show an artistic and philosophic immaturity that we don't want to promote. I would be much more okay with that because I think
Mhm.
it's true. But they didn't. They didn't acknowledge change. They didn't acknowledge growth is possible. And I
Well,
think
and
that's
in some ways
really
they couldn't,
troubling.
because some of the standards that they're using to cancel some of these, like McGilligray's Pool, right? Now, do you know what caused that book to get pulled?
Yeah, the reference to Eskimo fish.
Yes. Now, I'm gonna guess if you went out and polled most people in the country, most people in the United States have no idea that's offensive or why.
I mean, to give a little explanation, Eskimo means raw meat eaters. It's not a terribly respectful description of the people who inhabit the far north of the North American continent. However, most people don't mean that when they say Eskimo.
They wouldn't even know.
Exactly.
And the counter argument goes, well, then we have to educate you, and now you know, and so you should be fully aware. But meanings of words don't actually change to people that quickly.
Contrary to Merriam-Webster, who really likes to edit their words when a political controversy makes it expedient to do so.
Of course, especially if it's against a Republican.
Oh yeah. Um,
So so it's kind of like well, we know what you meant, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But if you didn't mean that, why are you using different terms?
and our founder, the founder of War Elephant, John Davis, wrote an answer about Dr. Seuss, which I think sums up our ultimate conclusion, which is that even though Christine and I talked to my dad today, he also is a bit ambivalent about some of Dr. Seuss's work. That is irrelevant when it comes to accessibility of it.
Yes,
You
and I agree
do
with that.
not, you do not defend free speech for the people you agree with. Of course you think people who agree with you should have free speech. It's the people who you're not wholly on board with that you need to stand up for. And I think that it's very disturbing that um, there seems to be a very powerful attempt to try out. Now, I've called this in other conversations a warning shot. And I mean by that, eBay, one of the largest online retailers of used products, has refused to let anyone sell these books on eBay. Now, this
Right.
is not true of Amazon, so it's not quite
Yet.
the same as some of the other attempts, but it is a targeted attempt to control people's commerce and people's ideas through online control.
Look at what's been happening with books that violate the trans orthodoxy,
Yeah,
and that's not just eBay. I mean, that does include
that one is
Amazon.
Amazon. They've actually completely deleted these books that are questionable because they're popular enough to actually change minds. And I think there are some people who either are in agreement with or who are afraid of people who believe things, um, who have made decisions that are extremely stifling of any kind of real free speech. And I think we need to keep the heat up here. I think we need to talk about Dr. Seuss. We need to talk about the fact that even if we don't agree with some of the things he said, I mean, if we're getting rid of books, as I mentioned, I don't like the Lorax. I would be perfectly happy if they got rid of that one. Of course, that's the liberals' favorite because it's a very preachy environmentalist fable. Um, but no, I think that should be out there. I would not read it to any child in my life. Um, but if a parent
But that'd
wanted
be
to
your
buy that for
choice.
their
I
child,
mean, there's
right?
there's a billion books out there, right? And
At least
you don't have to read them all, and nobody has to read Dr. Seuss, right?
no.
That that's the thing. But the idea that he has to be removed from the entire public consciousness and sphere is a pretty radical idea.
And when we mention the paper, that's sort of the foundation for a lot of these attempts, it really does say that because most of Dr. Seuss's characters are white or white coded, he participates in white supremacy. Defining the acknowledgement of a society's majority culture as white supremacy is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah. And it's not going to lead to good places at all. You know, it's interesting though, because there was a poll by Gallup that was done just a couple of years ago, and they asked people what percentage they believed of people in the United States were Black. And the perception across the board was that people believed between 30 and 65% of all people in the United States were Black. And I was thinking about this. Where were they getting this from? And they were getting this from just the representation that they're seeing on television. So there's already been a huge shift culturally to portray people, to portray more people, which was a well-motivated shift. But it's to the point where you would honestly believe that white people are a significant minority. And, well, not only that, it was something I noticed watching HGTV. I love watching HGTV, right? Watch it with my mom all the time because she just loved the home decorating shows. And if you watch that, you would believe at least 1 in 4 people in the United States are LGBTQ as well. And so the representations that are being portrayed are changing public opinions, which I guess shows just how powerful the negative ones must have been as well in days gone past.
Yeah, I was reading actually I wouldn't say a favorite, but I really like him as a TV writer. He was the creator and showrunner of a very short-lived show called The Middleman, which was about a nice Latina lady who falls in with a secret organization that saves the world. It's very humorous and whimsical, and the showrunner's Latino. And he was talking about what is the goal of the representation movement. And he said, because I've actually been asking this question, because it's not proportionate, because the number of characters who are Black and often Asian is generally actually more than the proportion of the population of America. So it's not proportionality. And this writer tweeted, not in response to me, I just followed him, that the goal is until no minority who is watching feels unrepresented. And I think that's very interesting because in one sense, that is a concrete goal. And I understand it too. In another sense, I think it's absolute poison because the idea that you can only feel represented when someone who looks and thinks like you is on the screen or is the main character destroys our ability to form bonds with people who are different, which is the most important thing that humans have to deal with. If men can't empathize with women, if Black people can't empathize with white people, and especially vice versa, if gay people can't empathize with straight people and straight people can't empathize with gay people, how are we going to make a better world? I am not, let me be clear, I am not saying we shouldn't have many different cultures, many different sexualities, I think we should have as many kinds of stories as we can with as many
because there's
kinds
all
of
those
people. Right. But the idea that representation is so that no one feels unrepresented, I think really needs to look differently. I think that is a recipe for an unending feeling of grievance where you don't need to have the grievance.
I think it's driving us into tribalism.
Absolutely. And we don't want to get to a place where the dominant cultural and ethnic group in a country feels like a minority, because a minority who feels under attack is violent. And if white people feel like a minority when they are not, we are in serious trouble.
Although we aren't very far from that.
No, we're very close.
From white people being a minority. If you follow
Well,
the
but
demographics.
even so, there will be a minority, but there'll be a plurality. They'll
Right.
still have way more people than anywhere.
Well, especially with the self-identification of many Hispanics as white. So the broadening of, and then of course, Asians are being called white adjacent.
which I think is actually the real key, that they have conflated poverty with race, which I think is really pernicious, because that means that to be black is to be poor. And I think that's, what are you saying with that? What are you saying when you say that successful ethnicities are white adjacent? You're saying that your ethnicity is poor adjacent. And I think I don't know how you would get away with saying that if you weren't powerful.
Well, it seems to me to be take a very dim view of a lot of people, and along with the idea that so many things that are good across the whole world reinforce white supremacy. And so all this cancellation really in terms of critical race theory. Well, okay, I'm going to say it specifically. In terms of critical race theory, we have to start out with the understanding that we have a theory that believes everything is power and that it's all a zero-sum game. Okay? And that the people who have the most wealth and power historically have created a system that is self-perpetuating, self-reinforcing, and forces the participation of absolutely everybody who interacts with it to build it up,
Forces
no matter
it
what.
with violence. Remember, it's explicitly about things like words are violence, and marginalization is violence, which justifies a violent response.
So I think we're going no place good with this. And I'm most going back to the Dr. Seuss, what I'm most worried about is, like you said, the limited access. So it's always been felt that the way to counteract bad ideas is with more ideas. And in some degree, this is what they're doing, like with the paper where they said, well, this is all racist, right? That's somebody putting out their ideas where they said, I saw this in Seuss's work and I think it's all wrong and it's bad and this is why. Had it stopped there, had it just been like, like people make decisions based on that, that's one thing. But when you have institutional power stopping access to the primary work itself so people can't judge for themselves at all, then you are engaging in an activist type of thing. And of course, critical race theory and all the critical theories are explicitly activist in nature. Their goal is not to put out ideas and have those ideas win in terms of convincing people. Their idea is to put out these ideas and then have them gain power and pretty much obliviate any counteracting thought.
Agreed. So, in conclusion, read Dr. Seuss critically. Read him with a thoughtful mind. Celebrate the much there is to be celebrated. Talk about the things you disagree with children in ways they'll understand. But do so with the understanding with the goal of increasing the connections we have with each other rather than cutting them off. Well, thank you, Christine. This is so great to have you back. And I know that you may be busy again in the coming weeks, but I hope to see you again soon. For those of you who are watching, please remember to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel or any of the various podcast platforms that this will be hosted on. Leave us reviews or comments. And above all, join our communities. We have a big platform on Quora and a very strong server on Discord, both of which are linked in our show notes. So go ahead and join those. We have assistance for writing, for people facing difficulties with hard questions, and we have lots of conversations from a conservative point of view, but not at all limited to conservative philosophy. So lots of different perspectives come together and talk about all kinds of life. So, until next week, read Dr. Seuss and think well.
Have a great week.